My name is Leon Smith. Over the past 5 years, I've spent some time studying an old preacher whose name was J.W. Little. The people around here all called him Preacher Jimmy Little, and he was really worth the study. I have a few things I want to show you about artifacts from his life. Here are some letters written with his own hand on tablet paper and pencil. Here is the Bible that he carried in his pocket. Here's a book about prayer that I was given. And you notice when I turn inside, we have his name, J.W. Little, Wingate, North Carolina. We're going to look at J.W. Little of Wingate, North Carolina, and how he preached and how he prayed, and how he became a man that was well worth the study in just a minute.
He said, "Fire away, my soul will be in heaven before the smoke dies out."
Then he prayed for rain, said it clouded up, and a large rain came up.
And the little boy fell, and when he did, the stick went through his jugular veins, and it caused him to die. And this
Whooped him down so bad, he gave it our old coat. What it's referring to is to give the best you had.
And there's 22 souls saved there in the ballpark. It just broke the ball game up.
When Preacher Little started preaching, he did not hold back. He would rear back, as the old folks say, and he'd let her go. We have some videotape of a man who actually heard Jimmy Little preaching in Marshville, and I want us to take a look at it now. The man's name is Olin Haney, and he's from Marshville, North Carolina. Let's look.
My first acquaintance with Preacher Jimmy Little was at Marshville at a fair. It was in late October. The year was 1913. They was having a fair at Marshville. They had a large field fenced in, and the fair was going on. And Preacher Little was there, and he would preach to the people downtown. There's a pretty good-sized cotton platform, and the people of the community raised cotton for a money crop, and there's where they sold their cotton. And the platform was loaded with cotton, and they threw some off on the ground. Well, Preacher Little stood on a bale of cotton to preach, and he used for his text, "Wine is a mockery, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise."
We were lucky enough to find these very posters that Mr. Haney talked about, and I believe he may have something else to say about them. I'm not sure. Is that the case? Let's take a look then at the cut with Olin Haney, and then we'll look at those very posters that we used in Marshville more than 60 years ago.
He had a large poster picture, some 2 feet square, something like that, and he had the picture of a burning fire, represented hell. On another one, he had a drunk man lying out here in a liquor jug beside him. He didn't say whiskey, he didn't say brandy, he said liquor, and says this man had a jug of liquor, and it showed to be half to 2/3 gone. The man had drunk himself almost to death. And he had another picture with a tree and a vulture sitting up in the tree, waiting on this drunk man that had drunk himself to death, and he was dead, waiting on him to get to the stage where the vulture would devour him.
The Wages of Sin posters are the ones here, and they were painted by a man whose name was H.F. Wolfe. The document I have in my hand here was typed up by Preacher Jimmy's son, who was Jamie Little, also a famous pastor of our region. He used a text from 1 John 3 and 4, and he titled these things, "The Wages of Sin." 1 John 3 and 4 says, "Whosoever committeth sin trespasseth also the law, for sin is a transgressor of the law. Let's take a look at these. First one, we have the whiskey hawk. You can say this bird of prey is talking about molesting people. You can see the whiskey hawk here. You can see the family over here with 2 children, a father, a mother, and another child. And Preacher Jimmy would say, this bird will get you if you don't watch out. The next poster, and these are quite old as you can tell, and I'm having a little bit of trouble getting them to turn, but I'll have them in just a second. The next one is very vivid to me. You'll notice that up here is something that looks like a vulture. Preacher Jimmy would probably call this a buzzard. If you look over here, you can see that it says, this bird of prey must not be molested in the U.S. Now look at the buzzard's children. This says a saloon. The nest is called a saloon, and then the buzzard's children are murder, corruption, and lust. Now look at his prey over here. If you look down here, you can see the father coming home from the plant where he worked. Here's the gate to the house. Here are his older child, I suspect. And here's another young child in his arms, another child, and the mother with the baby here. And the painting is called, although it's hard to see it down at the bottom, the painting is called Watching for Prey. The next poster, and these are, as I wanted to remind you, these are the actual ones that Preacher Jimmy used. We notice over here that we've got woe and contention and strife, and this painting over here, there is a man who is manning this cannon. There's another man who looks like he likes alcohol pretty well. You can notice he has the bottle in his pocket. Notice his house is not taken too good a care of. There are things like whiskey and wine and cider and rum on these cannonballs. Then over here we have a family, a mother and 2 children. The daughter here looks as if she is not exactly sure how to react to these people. Notice the happy home on this side. Notice the unhappy home on this side. The next poster, these are muslin. They're hand-painted by a man whose name was H.F. Wolfe. The only way I know that is his name is on some of them. All right, this one is the one that people remember the most. This one's quite vivid, probably because of the red dragon or red crocodile down here in the water. Notice that the man who is hanging here is hanging by a hook in his back, and he is suspended over the image of this crocodile. His sins are about to get him. Up here you can see it's small, but you can see it. There is a buzzard, and there are several other buzzards flying, waiting for the dead person who's thrown his life away because of alcohol. During the time Preacher Jimmy preached, and he was preaching from about 1875 to 1921, during a large portion of that time, alcohol was a big problem. This saloon is called a near beer saloon, and this is a blind tiger, which is another word I understand for this sort of saloon. Notice here that the father is on the way, or the preacher is trying to attack the blind tiger. We don't know what will happen. Notice that these helpless people are there, his family. Notice the unconcerned man over here on this side. You can see that he's reading the newspaper while the preacher is attacking the sin. The next poster is a very vivid one as well because of the colors. We've got 2 men here, one of whom is very famous. Over on this side we have Napoleon, and he is fairly recognizable. Above Napoleon, the poster says, "I have slain my hundreds." Then over here we have the Whiskey King, and above him it says, "I have slain my thousands." And of course there are bottles all over the place. So the Whiskey King had killed more people than Napoleon. Another of the most vivid of these posters is this scene from hell. Let's start on the left-hand side of it. On the left-hand side, you can see this skeleton. The skeleton is frightening this man. If you'll notice the man that down below him who is lying there, notice that something is coming out of his mouth, or this may be the part of the skeleton's bone. I can't tell. In some of these drawings, something coming from the mouth was the man's soul leaving. But since he is already in hell, perhaps his soul is already gone. Notice what has chained him. You can tell here that there is a chain attached to this man's midsection, and it is labeled rum. Right above him, we see an awful-looking snake. Then above here, a green one with a red mouth, and a speckled black and gray one. Notice right up above that, the flying dragon. And then over beside him, the Prince of Evil himself, complete as you look down with pitchfork. So this is a very vivid poster, and this one has been mentioned by many people. Many people who saw this thing 65 years ago still remember this poster. This poster shows the path from a good life to a bad life. If you'll notice in here in the very center, we see a church. We see also here, down below the church a little way, we see a fork in the road. Notice what's happening in the fork in the road. Two people are beginning to smoke. If we come down to the right-hand side of the road, we see the progression going a little further. We see them playing poker, sitting on a log out in the woods playing poker. Then if we come directly to the left of that, we see along the road people reading trashy literature, at that time called a dime novel. If we go directly below the dime novel, we see a dance hall painting. There's a dancing girl here in the dance hall, and she has her fan. Down below and to the side of her are some men shooting pool in a pool room. And then over here, there is an empty saloon, and you can see the bottles over here. And at the very bottom, which you can't see here, is the signature H.F. Wade, who painted who painted the paintings. All right, this one tells a story too. This one is aged more than some of them, but perhaps you can see it. Let's start by looking at the very center of the forest. If you can look right here where I have my hand, you'll be able to see three men. There's one face here, a darker face, a light face here, another darker face, although the painting has become faded. Notice the long rifle shot. The fire comes out, there's smoke, and down here we see the victim. Notice this man is taking his last drink. If we will look to the left of this man, we will see his friend who is leaving. We don't know what happened. I don't know what story Preacher Jimmy told, but this man perhaps got him in trouble, and now he's sneaking off, leaving his friend to die and be eaten by the buzzards. Let me show you the second phase of that. This painting has two parts. The second phase, start at the tree again, but go over here to this area. And here we can see in the tree, see the buzzards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and here they're beginning to come in. You can see them coming in there and beginning to light. Now, if we go directly down from that, we'll be able to see what has happened to the man. He lies there. His head is difficult to make out, but there it is, and there's blood coming from it. Here is his hat. And so the tale is told for him. He died a drunk. The final poster in this series deals with an actual event. And you can tell it from looking at this poster. This is a court scene, as you can tell. And it's called a judicial recall, and the date on the bottom of the poster is H.F. Wolf, 1912. These things were painted by hand. All right, notice what's gone on. Something caused this mountain man to come into this courtroom and kill these people. I suspect it had to do with alcohol. If you will come from him directly over, you can see that the judge has died. There has been a lot of shooting going on, and he's fallen across the bench. Here's a piece of glass from the globes that were above him. If we come all the way over here to the side, we can see a juror who is dying. And if you will notice here, this smoke shows that the juror's soul is going up. If we come up just a little bit with the camera perhaps, and we can see it right here. That's the soul moving up. Now, if we can come down here to the center of the courtroom, we can see the clerk and the attorney, and both of them have been killed. And their souls are mounting up to heaven. One here, and this one which you can see clearer here. Now, with these posters, Jimmy Little would have made the point that people should not use alcohol. If you use alcohol, it's going to cause you trouble. And these posters have stayed in many, many people's minds. Preacher Little knew if you show them a picture, they're much more apt to remember what was going on. How did Jimmy Little get this way? Well, I want us to think about that for a little bit, because we're going to see some information that talks about his early life. He was a very strong man. He was a powerful man, and he was a fighter. We're going to hear a story first that's humorous about how he liked to kill chickens for the table. This is his son talking, whose name is John B. Little.
He had a wonderful throwing arm. I know my mother, I've seen him do it, and mother would want a chicken, walk out in the yard and ask her which chicken she wanted. He'd pick up a little rock, and she would show him the chicken. He would point his left hand the chicken's head and throw the rock. I've never seen him miss.
Preacher Jimmy Little did not miss. He had what they called a dead eye, and he retained it through the rest of his life. He was a scrapper, and he knew how to fight. He had big fists. I think we may have a photograph of him and his second wife that we can show, that will show how wiry his fists were. I don't know if you can tell from looking at that photograph or not, but you can see that they're bony and they're big. And he used those fists to great advantage. And it was those very fists that led him to Jesus. His son, John B. Little, will tell us a story about how they were boxing on the creek bank.
Well, my daddy was a fighter as he was coming up. And back in those days, they called it towing the mark. And they usually fought to the finish. And I understand that he was fighting on the creek bank one Sunday. And there was a church up on the hill. And they injured this man very bad. And after that, him and some of the others went up to the church. And he joined the church that day and gave his heart to God and fought no more.
When Jimmy Little gave his heart to somebody, it stayed, it stuck. But although Jimmy Little became a saved man after that fight on the creek bank, he didn't immediately give up all his old tactics. Let me read you an article that is a photocopy from the Messenger and Intelligencer of Wadesboro, the M&I, from May 26, 1904. Basically what's going on here was two Mormon elders came to Wingate and Jimmy Little went for them. Let me just read you real quickly. Mr. Little and the elders engaged in conversation, and the subject of polygamy as practiced by the Mormons was sprung. One of the elders said that he had no argument against polygamy, but the Mother of Christ practiced it. The assertion was too much for Mr. Little, and we learned that he told the elder that he could say what he pleased about Jimmy Little, but he had gone too far in slandering that woman, that is Jesus' mother. And with that declaration, he landed a fist on the elder's mouth. And the elder, not being a man of war, turned to flee, and as he did so, Mr. Little kicked him, and also kicked the other elder, and threw a valise, which one of them had left after them, and warned them never to come to Wingate again. And they never did. So the interesting thing about this thing is that Jimmy Little was a man who, during early Christian life, did not mind fighting. It's funny in a way. Well, there was an instance that I want to show with a painting that we had done that we call the Mountain Man. He was down in Starr, North Carolina, preaching. And as he was preaching, he said that anybody that made liquor was so low they'd steal the quarters off a dead man's eyes. The man got up and waited for Jimmy Little till after the service was over and then attacked him with a big knife, as you can see here. Preacher Little picked up a rock and defended himself so well that the man himself charged Preacher Little with assault. Well, he got away with it, obviously. Nobody could bring a case like that against a preacher, I think, and get away with it. But the man did try. I found that a very interesting story. There's another poster I want to show about liquor steals. Now, Jimmy Little was not afraid of people who made liquor. It did not bother him a bit. And so let's look at this painting, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about some of the things that went on. Jimmy would go to a still, and he did not care who ran the still or anything about it. He would go and meet the people. This one shows a stick in his hand. I don't know him ever to have attacked anybody that did not attack him first, but I do know of instances where he went to get a still, and he came back in his Model T with the still in the front seat and the stiller in the back. And if you know anything about people who make liquor in North Carolina, you know that they don't give over their stills unless something miraculous happens. There was another interesting story about Jimmy Little, too, about he was supposed to have died. He was riding his buggy and headed to Waxhaw, where he was preaching at that particular time. Something happened that spooked the horse, and he was a very good horseman, so I don't know what happened, but something happened, and the horse was spooked, and the buggy was found totally and completely demolished, and the horse had run away someplace. Well, the word got out that Preacher Jimmy Little was dead. Some of his friends went to Waxhaw to look for him, and guess what they found? They didn't find him in the church. They didn't find him outside the church, but over in a pond nearby the church where they did the baptizing, there old Jimmy Little stood, baptizing folks. He might have been scratched up a little bit, but it would take much more than that to hurt Jimmy Little. He was not afraid of anything at all. Matter of fact, his daughter told me that he went after Stiller after Stiller after Stiller and looked directly into the gun. If we can see this tape of Jimmy Little's daughter, Maddie Moffitt, she'll tell us this story.
That was the biggest still that they'd had in that part of the country, the way it was told to me. And so he gets out, he starts to the still. They said, Brother Little, you better get back in that, whatever his transportation was, you better get back in there. He said, we're going to shoot if you come a step further. Stop. He said, fire away, my soul will be in heaven before the smoke dies out.
Preacher Little learned how to read with great difficulty. He left school about the 2nd grade, as best as I can tell, and he never had any formal education after that. But he did choose for his first wife, who died in 1895. Well, they were married in 1875. His first wife was named Jenny Croson. We have a photograph of her. Jenny was dark hair, and she was attractive. This is a painting. But Jenny taught him to read, and it was very interesting to see that she would do it. But she did. She read the scripture for him, and she taught him to read, and she became a very good friend as well as a helper. I want to talk for a minute or two now, though, about the funny parts of his life. We'll come back to some of the more serious things in a minute, but the funny parts of his life. John B. Little has some of the jokes his father told, because things that happened to Jimmy Little he would tell other people about. That's how the stories got out. And his son tells us a story about a man who got baptized, or who almost got baptized, but something intervened. Let's look at John B. Little talking about his daddy.
He was baptized in a pond one day, and one of the men there that he was to baptize had confessed his religion in Christ. He started in, my father was standing out in there, and he said, come out a little deeper. And he was tongue-tied. He said, Bridget, do you need that snake? He said, I said, come in a little deeper. I can't understand you. He said, you need that snake. He said, come just a little deeper. He said, Bridget Little. He said, don't you need that warning moccasin?
I don't know whether that man got baptized or not, but Jimmy Little told the story. He told another story, too, about things happening at home, or he did a funny thing at home. Now, a preacher that goes off and stays months at a time, being an evangelist, working in tent meetings, as Preacher Jimmy did, when he comes home, sometimes there's a little bit of discipline that needs to be done with the children. Here's how he handled one particularly interesting situation. John B. Little speaks.
We were living on the Lawyer's Road at that time. There come this snow and some sleet in the snow. And the older children took his baptizing hip boots out and slid down the bank with them till they wore the seat out. So when they got back to the house, he always whipped the older boys and all with a razor strap. He'd done a lot of popping, but not so much damage. And he whipped every one of them except me, just give me a little pat on the head. And then he carved on his razor strap, I need thee every hour.
I need thee every hour, the title of the old hymn. John B., I should tell you, was the baby. He was the youngest of 14 children, and that's the reason he got patted on the head or patted on the back a little bit and didn't get the razor strap. Preacher Jimmy Little in his later years was a man who, when he got on his knees and prayed, you knew something was going to happen. Sometimes, though, funny things happen with respect to this. Here's one person's reaction to Jimmy Little's praying for rain. Again, John B. speaks.
Had an awful dry spell. I believe that was around Marshall, North Carolina. And several of the preachers had met and prayed for the rain. And they asked my father to come and pray for rain. He brought his raincoat and umbrella with him. And I said, Preacher Jimmy, said, there's not a cloud in the sky. He said, if you don't have faith, it won't rain. Said, you must have faith. And it said that he, in his sermon, and he prayed for rain, said it clouded up, and a large rain came up. Said one of the Methodists looked out the window and saw some of the things in his field there floating off. Said, you might know Preacher Jimmy Little would overdo the thing.
Well, now, Baptists like Preacher Jimmy like to pick on Methodists. I don't know who that person was that said that, but I'm sure he did say Preacher Jimmy would overdo the thing, because he did have a sort of concentration, and he would not even know anything was around going on. Matter of fact, his daughter tells us that Preacher Jimmy actually missed the wedding of one of his children. Mattie Moffett tells us the story.
My sister Esther was to be married when we lived on Lawyers Road. And Mr. Carroll, the Baptist minister of the church that we had attended, was to perform the wedding ceremony. And all the house was filled with guests, and she was married in the living room. And my father was sitting in the, what we called the den at that time, talking to Mr. Perry. And they tried to get his attention that the minister was ready to perform the wedding ceremony, but he and Mr. Perry were in a deep discussion about something. So finally I went and told my father that my sister was already married to get up and come on. And that's really the way it was.
Oh, bless his heart. But he did know how to put his attention where the attention needed to go. Another funny thing that he did, and I can't imagine many preachers today doing it, was he bought him a sign and put it on his mode of transportation and would drive it up and down the roads or streets in towns that he would come to, whether he knew anybody or not. Here's what he did. Look at the sign. On the horse it says, "The saloons must go." And he would stand in that buggy and he would yell and he would tell people that the saloons had to go. And sometimes it caused a fight. One final thing I have to tell you is just an image. I don't have a photograph to talk about it, but just an image. Some people told me that one particular man in the Polkton area, who was known for drinking liquor, had spent many happy hours running from Preacher Jimmy Little. He said that the two of them would run so fast, Preacher Jimmy trying to catch this other man, that their coattails would stand out. So the first phase, I guess, of Preacher Jimmy Little's Christian life was one marked by a lot of force. He was a man who could fight. He's a man who would get you saved in spite of yourself. The next phase, though, is one I like to call rough knees. They tell me that the old folks said that a mortuarian or a funeral director could tell a good preacher from a bad one. And the way they said he could do it was by looking at their knees. If a preacher had smooth knees, it showed that he hadn't prayed much. If he had rough knees, it showed that he had prayed a lot. Preacher Jimmy had rough knees, but he reached that point fairly slowly. Let me tell you one quick story about his wife before we take a look at a videotape I have of one major change. Some trouble came to his life. On August the 15th, 1895, he and his wife were supposed to go to church. She didn't go because she was sick. She was stricken suddenly by appendicitis, and then doctors could do nothing about that. And she died within 24 hours. It left him bereft. It left him with the survivors of their 7 children. I don't know exactly how many that was, but here he was alone, a man with a family, and almost distraught. Something else happened to him very shortly after that to show him that preachers should not use tobacco. Here's a story that Mrs. Bivens told us about that.
This little boy, a member of the family that was about 7 years old, came along, and he was just having the best time, had a broomstick or something, and that he was riding, and that he had something in his mouth, a stick in his mouth, and they asked him what he was doing, and he said that he was the preacher, that he was doing just like the preacher, like Mr. Little. And the little boy fell, and when he did, the stick went through his jugular veins, and it caused him to die. And Mr. Little, from that time on, just realized that that was an influence that he could not keep, and he was so repentant of it until he never did smoke anymore. And
so he gave up cigarettes. His wife died. The cigarette smoking was shown to him as a sin. He'd already given up alcohol years and years before. but there still remained the lightning. In 1907 or 1908, and we're not sure of the exact date, he was at Lemon Springs near Sanford and was stricken by lightning. His son, John B., tells the story.
Oh, he was whittling under a tree, and that's when his health started going down, I understand. The lightning struck it, burnt the knife up, and paralyzed one of his sides. I forgot which side it was, but he was quite a while getting over it. He had no fear of lightning or anything, but after that, when the storm come up, he would come in.
So, lightning struck him. He stayed in bed for about 6 months, and nobody really knows what happened during that period of time. Much of the time he was in a coma. His family had to feed him. We have a drawing here that will picture that in a fairly realistic way. Lying there unconscious. We don't know what happened. But the family and those who knew him seemed to think that when Jimmy Little came back to preaching after spending the time in bed, having been struck by lightning, that he was a different man. What I think happened was that he learned to get closer to Jesus. I think he also learned to spend more time on his knees. Up to this time, I don't have evidence that a great amount of his time was spent on his knees. After this time, there is evidence that he spent a great deal of time. And he was able, after a while, during a drought, to pray for rain. Let's listen to Olin Haney as he tells us about that.
It had been dry for some time, and it was real dry weather, and it looked like the crops were going to completely ruin, and they set the next day to meet at the schoolhouse to pray for rain. And he says, bring your umbrellas. Well, he brought his umbrella, and he came on a little old two-wheel cart-like thing. Drove a horse, brought his umbrella, and then went in and he prayed for rain. And when they went out of church, he wouldn't even open his umbrella. He got wet. It rained, too. Now, that happened.
And a little bit, Preacher Jimmy jumped up from there. He had his Bible in one hand and his handkerchief in the other, wiping sweat. He come running towards the front door. He said, if you got anything you don't want to get wet, he said, you better get it in, get home, get it in, it'll rain for night. And I never will get, I said, all right, now I'll see if it does. Now that was just my little bit of faith, all I had. But buddy, whenever, about 4 o'clock, I guess there's 25 people come from over there at my daddy's and stuff. And about 4 o'clock, it thundered up overhead. There weren't just a little sign of a cloud. Well, it weren't just a little bit, it thundered again. Well, it weren't but just a few minutes. It went to raining. And it didn't come a storm. It just rained the prettiest rain you've ever seen fall.
And it rained because Preacher Jimmy Little had learned to get on his knees, to ask the Master, and to wait till he got the answer. Now, you know that a man like this naturally would cause some fusses, and he did. One article in the newspaper tells that if Jimmy Little would be a good man and a good Baptist and leave alone people like Pentecostals and women preachers, that he would do well. He did have an unusual ministry. He did spend some time with people that were not the average kind of congregation, but hundreds of people would be saved in one of his meetings. In 1913, he held a meeting in Wingate, North Carolina, at the Meadow Branch, or near the Meadow Branch Church. And during that time, there was a problem with some cigarettes. Now, basically what happened was he went to each store in the area and bought up all the cigarettes because he felt like the students at the Wingate School should not be smoking, and he had seen some of them do it. Well, during the meeting, he gets everybody together, and they go up, as I can tell, they go up on Main Street, douse the cigarettes with some kerosene, or coal oil, as they called it then, and set them aflame. Now, I don't know whether this is what made people mad or not. I don't know, because Jimmy Little would also attack some preachers in the pulpit. If he felt that they were not doing the way they should, he would say so in the pulpit. At any rate, some people got upset with him. And at the 59th annual session of the Union Baptist Association, and this is a photocopy of those minutes, a very interesting thing happened. If I turn inside here, I can find a resolution that will say that Jimmy Little should not be allowed to preach in Union County. Let me read that to you. I'm going to turn now and read the actual resolution to you. It's on page 15 of those minutes, and it says, "Whereas it has come to the knowledge of this body that there is confusion among some of our churches and brethren concerning the methods and doctrine of J.W. Little, and whereas we have information that J.W. Little has from time to time reflected on our brethren in the ministry, and that J.W. Little is very extravagant in his statements, be it resolved that we, the Union Association, go on record that we do not approve of such methods." After remarks of several of the brethren, the resolution was unanimously adopted. Well, now this was a shock to Jimmy, I'm sure, because it meant that at least for the time being, he was not welcome in churches in Union County. But in the tent in Marshville, he was taken very, very good care of. Let's listen to some of the examples of how he was taken care of for doing the work he believed was the Lord's work, and I do too. Here's a story about how he was taken care of in a train.
He was going, and he wanted to get off at a certain place. And they didn't want to stop. They didn't think they could stop unless it was county seat, you know, or town at least. And he told me, yeah, he wanted to get off down there now. He had a special place he wanted to get off. He told him no, and he told them, well, they would. They'd stop. He went on down through there, and it got about the path that he wanted to get off at, and run a hot box on the train. So he got off where he wanted to anyhow, and went on out on his field. Now, some people would laugh at something like that. Some people would laugh at that, but I can't laugh at things like that. Now, I tell you something. I can feel more power about that than to do something like that, you know. I ain't even in talking about it. Me and you.
I don't think it's funny either, except that a man could predict when he prayed that God would answer. Jimmy Little stayed clean. When God was requested, God answered. Well, there's another story, and this Mr. Boyce Nash from Marshville that was just speaking is going to speak again now, talking about how he was taken care of when he didn't have food. Now, a preacher like Jimmy Little depended on offerings, but he went whether there was money or not. And there were many times when there was not enough food in the house. Here's one time the Lord took care of him, one of many.
He said, you know, my folks hadn't got a bite to eat in their house. And he said that while they were standing there, and I've heard this told several times, but the other ones too, that somebody come riding up on a one-horse wagon and wanting to know where Preacher Jimmy lives, and he said, he told him, says, there he stands right there. He said, well, I've got a wagon just about loaded with groceries and things out in the garden, what have you. Said, I'm hunting him. And I don't even know where he knew the man or not now. I just don't know. I assume that he did know the man, at least.
In later parts of Jimmy Little's life, Preacher Jimmy's life, he began to be spoken to by God. He started out by speaking to God, first answering the call to be saved, then speaking to God, asking for requests. But the time really did come when God spoke to him. Here's a story that G.T. Little tells about how he went and preached at a ball game.
Here, and said I was sitting on the church on the porch.
Of the little hotel.
Yeah, and I had my feet up on the banister and said, looked like the whole town come by. And they didn't know him. Said, ain't you going out to the ball game? He said, no. Said, I ain't going. And he said, they just kept on, people stopping, seen him sitting there and they wouldn't know why I wasn't going. Said directly, he said, the Lord said, go. He just got up and went on to the ball game. And whenever they got to hollering and going, he said, I just forgot myself. First thing I knowed, I was preaching. And there's 22 souls saved there in the ballpark. It just broke the ball game up.
Oh, my goodness. Jimmy Little was used to being not too planned. Let me give you an example. He was in a church at Mineral Springs in Anson County, I understand, from some of the people around, and two young men at the middle of the service got up and left. Preacher Jimmy Little said, "Wait a minute. Y'all excuse me for a minute. I'll be back in a second." He went outside and got those two boys and brought them in by the scruff of the neck, set them back down in the seat, said, "Now don't you move," and finished his service. But he had another situation happen that's much more serious, I think, and yet it's a little funny too, in South Carolina with what I have begun to call the gospel hound dog. G.T. Little tells the story.
These men wouldn't come to church. They'd go back to an old store building up there and sit and gamble. And Preacher Jimmy went to him a time or two every day. I mean, one every day for a time or two, and tried to get them to come to church. Well, they wouldn't promise them they'd come. They wouldn't come and say they wouldn't. But one night, anyhow, they run it a week, and Preacher Martin said he was wanting to quit. Said, Preacher Jimmy said, "I ain't going to close this meeting until them men comes to church." And on Tuesday night, the next week, he was up for preaching, and an old dog come in, hound dog come in, and walked up and lay down on the pulpit, on the rostrum there. And they said that man grabbed that dog up and threw him out through the window, knocked the old window sash out, and didn't even break his speed as preaching, preached right on just the same as if he hadn't done that. And the next night, every one of them men was there to hear him preach.
So the dog got their attention. I hope the window was open as we showed in the picture, and I hope the dog was not hurt, and I'm sure he wasn't. But the point of the matter was that Jimmy Little heard the Lord say, "Throw the dog," and he did. And the men that he was praying for came to church. One of the most famous elements, though, in Jimmy Little's life has to do with Rocky River Springs. Rocky River Springs was a resort in the area that many people went to during the 4th of July and other warm areas. You can see here this picture from a brochure shows a couple of the buildings at Rocky River Springs. None of those are there today. That's all changed. But some interesting things happened at Rocky River Springs, and I want us to think about them for a few minutes. During the research we did for this video, I talked to several people who were there when the dance hall fell. That's the most popular story about Jimmy Little in this entire area. And Mr. Fred Balcom is going to tell us a little bit about Rocky River Springs, and then we're going to hear about how the dance hall actually fell and what happened to make it fall. Let's listen to Mr. Fred Balcom.
Well, I'm standing approximately right on the site where the pavilion was built, and approximately the distance right down in here where it fell, and right over here is where the Preacher Jimmy Little knelt down and prayed for the stopping from dancing so he could preach. And I'm standing just about the center of the pavilion.
Ms. Ruth Bennett, who is an excellent researcher and has helped me a lot with this production among a lot of other people, talks about the dance hall as well. Let's see what she has to say.
Why do you think the floor fell in the dance hall?
Well, there are two opinions there. One was a result of his prayer. The other was maybe too much weight was on the floor. But the weight was there before he prayed.
And you know, Miss Ruth?
All right, the important thing to understand here was that there was a dance going on at the dance hall. There was a dance going on, and Preacher Jimmy Little prayed, and the floor fell right after the prayer. Let's listen to what some other people said. One person, Mrs. Lee Carpenter's father, went under the place to check the sills or the wooden structure under the building and found out something. Let's see what she found out.
My daddy, Charlie Balcom, was over at Rocky River Springs when the incident happened that the church Preacher Jimmy Little prayed for the building, to fall in. He was out in the front of the building, and when it fell in, he went around and looked under there, and he said those seals was just as sound as a dollar, and he couldn't see any reason other than the faith the preacher had from falling in.
Said it, and I was standing right within 2 foot of Preacher Jamie when he was praying. And he said she went down. And there wasn't no fault of the timber. The timber just couldn't take the pressure they was put on it. For the good Lord, he can turn the world upside down.
Another person, Mr. Burgess, was there, and he tells us why he believes the building fell at the very time that Preacher Little prayed. Let's listen to him.
I remember we were standing around there listening to the preacher preach, and we heard a big slam. And so most of the people run up there. I didn't go right then. But before that, he had prayed for us to stop up there. And when that slam come down, why, it broke in, you know, it all fell to the bottom. So his prayer was answered.
Do you think that the prayer caused it to fall?
Well, yeah, I believe in prayer that much. I believe it caused it to fall. Because they were making such a fuss, you know, he couldn't, well, the people couldn't hear him preaching. And I suppose it was about a couple of 100 feet from where he was preaching up to the place, the dance hall. So when it fell in, he preached right on, but most of his crowd went up to see what happened.
I think the lightning in the dance hall are things that introduced the third phase of Preacher Jimmy Little's life. This point was a time of mighty power, and this was a time that few of us may really understand. But Fred Balcom talks about a time when he was preaching and the jail doors couldn't keep him in. Let's see what Mr. Balcom has to say.
So he'd go to Charlotte and get on the streetcar and preach. Of course, as they passed a new ordinance up by there, he couldn't preach on the street because it'd gather people up in a crowd, you know, and get in the way and run over a wagon. There wasn't no buggies at those times, but cars. And policemen arrested him and carried him down and put him in jail, locked him up. And policeman went on back up on his duty, on his beat. And he looked around, and I stood Jimmy Little. He'd done about beat him up there. And Jimmy said, "I'll come in and preach. I'm going to preach." And I think he carried him back a second time. I've heard him tell it 2 or 3 times. And
Okay. G.T. Little tells a story that he has heard about another time the Lord spoke or divinely intervened in the life of Jimmy Little. This dealt with a revival and a bootlegger who was selling alcohol to people who ought to have been in church. G.T. Little tells us the story.
There's having a revival meeting there, and Fred was going to the meeting. And the young boys, this man was selling liquor, and the young boys was going up there and getting a drink of liquor before they go to church, and then they got disturbing the people in the church that drinking. And Preacher Jamie and Preacher Martin went up there to talk to him. And he was lying on the bed, and he had one leg. And they talked to him about stopping it and witnessed to him. While they were sitting there, he reached over and got his jug of liquor and turned it up to a gallon jug and took him a drink out and set it down. Said, "Preacher Jimmy," when they started leaving, he says, called him by name, but I can't call it. He said, "I'm sorry that you feel like you do. But he said, the next time you turn that jug up to take a drink, you're going to die." And he said, "God told me that." And it said that when they went on out, Preacher Martin said, "Preacher Jimmy," he said, I wish you hadn't said that to him." He says, "Why did you say that?" He said, "I don't know why I said it." He said, "God told me to say it." And they went on out. And the next morning, somebody found the man. He was dead in the bed.
An interesting story. Another interesting story, similar to this but somewhat different, deals with a man who came to Jimmy Little's house when it was cold and disagreeable outside, and what Jimmy Little did and what the Lord said to him. Fred Balcom tells the story.
In the house with a fire, somebody knocked on the door. He got up, went and opened the door for him, and there's a, so to speak, is a beggar in those days, the way we call him, you know. And he asked him, would he let him come in warm? It's an awful cold day. And he told him, well, sure, come on in. So they had their conversation. And they got ready to leave. He said, well, it's mighty cold. He said, ain't you cold those clothes on? He said, he certainly was. So he went back and got an overcoat he had and discarded, hung there in the closet. Went back and gave it to him, put it on him, said, now you can go your way, you'll stay keep warm. So he went on down the road, said, I kept bearing on his mind, why did you give that old rag, wore out rag? Why didn't you give me a best coat? And he said, just bore his mind to bed, and he opened the door and run down the road and hollered. He hollered and called and said, hey, stop, come back. And so the fellow stopped. Said, what do you want? Said, you just come back to the house. Got back to the house, said, pull off that coat. He said, mister, I appreciate that coat. That coat will keep me warm. So he reached back in his closet and pulled out another and used best coat. Told him to put that one on. And of course he said, now you can be on your way. That was about all he had to say about it. He said, the Lord wouldn't just whipped him down so bad, he gave him that old coat. What he's referring to is to give the best you had. And
Preacher Balcom heard Preacher Little, or Mr. Balcom heard Preacher Little tell this story at Rocky Mount Church in Anson County. In June 1921, Preacher Little conducted his last revival. It was in Polkton. And during that time, he began to have another, what they call, spell with his heart, perhaps related to the lightning striking him some 20 years before, or 13, 14 years before. At any rate, he was not able to preach after that, and on August the 14th, 1921, Jimmy Little died in the hospital in Charlotte. His funeral was held in Marshville at the Marshville Baptist Church, and his body lies in the Marshville Cemetery. 3,000 people came to his funeral. Remember, this is 1921. Not much transportation. They had to come by foot or by train, and some few by automobile. Preacher Jimmy died like he lived, witnessing for the Lord. The painting that you see on the screen shows his hand on his Bible. His Bible, and the reason I didn't show his big Bible a while ago, is that no one has it. It is buried with him in Marshville. His finger is to the scripture, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. There's an interesting story I heard about Jimmy Little while I was doing this research, and I heard it at second hand. But a friend of a person I was talking to said, you know, I wish I could hear old Jimmy Little again. I never experienced the Spirit of God except in his meetings. Well, Jimmy Little's gone. There's not a lot left. There's a Bible and a few letters and a photograph or two, most of which I have. But he lives in the hearts of the people. And he was the kind of man that I'd like to have known. And he's the kind of man I think Christians today ought to try to be more like. To believe in Jesus, to go after him with all their heart, and to become men and women of prayer. Thank you for watching with me. I've enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again.
This has been an Olive Branch production.